It's a shockingly light sentence for this now convicted sex offender who sexually assaulted two 15-year-old hockey players who she met in a hotel hot tub while on a staycation with her family. After that, she followed the boys to their hockey game and even kept in contact with them on Snapchat, begging them not to call police. We've talked about this story before on Law&Crime, but here's a quick refresher of the details. The defendant is 38-year-old Allison Leigh Schardin. She lives in Blaine, Minnesota, which is just north of the Twin Cities. Last January, Schardin, her husband, and two sons decided to have a weekend staycation, so they booked a hotel room in Roseville, Minnesota, not too far from where they live. Also staying at that same hotel, a boys hockey team from Colorado in town for a hockey tournament. On January 13th of last year, the boys went to the hotel pool after a team dinner, and at the same time, Schardin was in the sauna. Let's pause right here to note that all the boys involved in this story were underage at the time, so their names haven't been revealed. And in court documents, they're referred to as victims 1, 2, and 3. According to court docs, victim 1 said rather than go to the pool right away, he was in his room packing for their return trip home the next day when he received a photo of Schardin from a teammate with a message telling him you wouldn't believe what happened and telling him to come down to the pool area and hang out with the team, so he did. While victim 1 had been upstairs, Schardin got into the hot tub with the other boys and began telling them about the issues she was having with her husband. She told the boys that she cheated on her husband a few weeks ago and had sex with a junior hockey player. That means he was in the age range of 18 to 20 years old. Schardin also told the boys that her husband hits her, but that they're trying to work it out. At one point during all this, Schardin's husband came down to the pool area and yelled words to the effect of, "If you don't come upstairs, our relationship is over." By 10 o'clock that night, the boys left the pool to make curfew, but not before Schardin asked for their social media info, specifically Snapchat. They exchanged the information and then were on their way. A while later, though, 3 of the boys snuck out of their rooms to meet up with Schardin at the pool once again. They saw her husband for a second time during all of this too, when he came down and started talking about it being the last chance for their marriage. Soon after all this, the boys left the pool once again and went to victim 1's room. A little while later, he got a Snapchat message from Schardin saying she'd gotten into an argument with her husband and that she wanted to come to the boys' room. 2 of the teammates did not want Schardin coming to the room, but victim 1 said he agreed to let her come because her husband was abusive and she needed help. Several boys left the hotel room, leaving only victims 1, 2, and 3 alone with Schardin. She told the boys she was scared of her husband, but she left the room for about an hour anyway. When she came back to victim 1's room, Schardin continued to ask the boys sexual questions, including how sexually active they were, and specifically asked victim 3 what sexual things he liked to do with his girlfriend. Schardin straight up asked the boys how old they were during this time too, and they told her they were 15. She said she was 38, also saying they were young enough to be her kids. According to court docs, after all of this, things escalated. Schardin told the boys they could touch her breasts, and both victims 1 and 2 did. After that, she took off her pants and asked victim 1 to explore down there. Victims 1 and 2 touched between her legs and kissed her, and after a while, Schardin asked victims 2 and 3 to leave her alone with victim 1, so they went to wait in the bathroom. Okay, I know you're multitasking when you're watching these videos, and if you're out and about running errands, listen up. I have to tell you about this free app called Upside that gives you cash back on daily essentials. I use Upside every time I pump my gas because it's so easy and it's free, so why not? Here's what you do. Download the Upside app and claim an offer for whatever you're buying. Simply pay as usual and then follow the steps on the app to get paid. To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on your screen and use our promo code LCNews to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. As they were leaving, Schardin asked victim 3 if he had a condom, but he didn't. Victim 1 later said he was thankful because he did not want things to go that far, and Schardin was insisting on them having sex. Victim 2 and victim 3 each said they peeked around the corner from the bathroom and saw Schardin, who was nude, with victim 1's penis in her mouth. Victim 2 also said he heard Schardin asking victim 1 to do the same to her, but victim 1 declined. After that, he digitally penetrated her. During all this, victim one told police that Schardin was saying things like, let's just do more. Let's have sex. We're already here. You already have a 38-year-old woman, a female, in your bed. Don't you want to do more? He said that in his head, his response was not really, but he responded by saying, sure, though he wasn't totally on board with it. Schardin only left the hotel room when the boys said they had a hockey game the next day and had to go to sleep. When it came time for that game, Schardin messaged the boys asking them which rink they were playing at. The boys didn't want to see her though, so they told her that their team had already lost, but a short while later, she still showed up at the rink. Victim one said they all started getting nervous and he was shaking on the bench at one point because he wanted to leave what happened the night before in the past, and she was trying to follow them. Quote, it was really creepy. When the boys returned home to Colorado, Schardin kept on messaging them on Snapchat. She messaged victim one saying something to the effect of, I will do or say anything you want, just don't tell the police or report what happened. Victim one said he wouldn't tell the police and just wanted to be left alone, so he blocked Schardin. It was victim two who actually contacted the police on January 22nd of last year to report Schardin. Victim two showed investigators the messages Schardin had sent him, specifically messages about victim one. Schardin then went on to apologize for going to their game and said things like, I didn't know he didn't want me to, I feel so bad, and ugh, he regrets getting his first blowjob. Schardin was arrested on February 1st and taken into custody, and shockingly, she was pretty honest right away. Schardin told investigators that when she met the boys, they asked for her social media handles, and she felt flattered, so she was happy to have the attention. She also admitted that she went inside a hotel room with 3 underage boys and claimed they asked her to take her clothes off. She also admitted to lying in bed with one of the boys, saying they were, quote, kissing, and I gave him oral sex, and I think he fingered me for a little bit, and that was it. She also admitted to asking for a condom, but said she wasn't going to go through with it. Here's the next thing Schardin said, and it goes a bit back and forth, but this is a direct quote. She says, I think things were starting to progress, and I think I thought about it for a moment, and then I just was like, yeah, no, that's not. And I think at that point, it was pretty evident that victim one was kind of uncomfortable. Schardin was charged with criminal sexual misconduct in the 3rd degree and criminal sexual conduct in the 4th degree. She pleaded guilty to the charges in May of last year, and in October finally reached a plea deal with prosecutors. As part of that deal, Schardin pleaded guilty to the charge of criminal sexual misconduct in the 3rd degree, so her other charge was dismissed. Just this month, Schardin was finally sentenced, and some critics are saying it's kind of a short sentence. Prosecutors had asked for the highest possible sentence of 8 years. They wrote in part, quote, the defendant's behavior was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was clearly planned. Why else would an adult engage contact information with juveniles that she just met in a hotel and then later go to their room? Another part of their filing reads, quote, they have lost friends and they have had to endure whispers and harmful comments from others as if they were the perpetrators. Both victims were initially suspended from their hockey team, though they were later reinstated after they explained what happened. That victory was short-lived, however, as team officials then decided to cancel the rest of the season. But Schardin's sentence wasn't the max of 8 years. Instead, she was given time served for the 5 days she spent in jail after her arrest, and her next sentence was to spend only 2 more weekends in jail. All right, so once again, we're talking about another case where we have a female predator and young children. We got to bring in our expert here, Serena Townsend, criminal defense attorney. And Serena, right from the top, I have to ask you, what do you think about the sentencing? She could have faced up to 8 years, but do you think the sentence was light?
I actually do think the sentence was light. First of all, some of the things that judges take into account when sentencing somebody is their past history, at their age, their proclivity to potentially reoffend, but also their past history. And I noticed that she had a recent DWI conviction, which is not good. I mean, it's terrible. It shows an impulsivity, it shows a recklessness, and it shows a willingness to break the law. And I know it's not a prior sex crime, but it's still very, very disturbing that she had this previous conviction and now she's got this one. I'm very surprised at how low the sentence was in this case.
And prosecutors were really hoping for the top sentence. They actually brought up some of the boys who were victims in this case, that they have lost some of their friends. It's hard to go to school, kind of describing what the victims were going through in all of this. And she's facing just a couple of weekends, which I guess that's my next question too, is it's not like 30 days, 90 days. It's 2 weekends, which I've never heard of before. Is that normal?
It's not normal, but it does happen. You sometimes do have defense attorneys who are successful in making that argument to a judge and getting a judge to agree to weekends in jail. Usually there's some sort of reason for it, some mitigation, something to kind of explain why they can't just serve the time like a normal person. Sometimes it has to do with, maybe it's just a very short period of time that they have to serve, a short sentence. Sometimes they have medical issues that they have to attend to on certain days during the week. I'm not sure exactly why the judge allowed for her to be able to serve weekends, but it just goes to show the level of leniency in this case that she was given, despite the fact that it is a pretty serious act of crime against two separate teenage boys. It's surprising to me.
I personally think it's lenient too, especially if we go back to the 8 years that she could have faced, and she's just facing a couple of weekends behind bars. And then you pointed out her past conviction. She's obviously convicted in this case. You talked about why the judge might have gone easy, so to speak, on her. Why do you really think that is? I mean, the defense just brought a really good case forward, even though it was a plea deal. I mean, I still just can't make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of times the prosecution and the judge also looks at the desire for not kind of re-traumatizing the victims in the case. So you have these two 15-year-old boys and then a third 15-year-old boy who was present but didn't engage. And that clearly, based on not only the story itself, but based on what we heard them tell police, was an extremely traumatizing experience for them. They mentioned they had been like shaking on the bench when she showed up to their hockey game after having this sexual encounter with them, which is like stalker vibes. It's definitely scary. And so I wonder if part of the reason for this plea was to avoid trial. That happens when you go to trial and you have to put people on the stand. You have to put the victims on the stand to testify. It does reopen those wounds. It does re-traumatize them, but you also, end up facing a higher sentence if you go to trial when you're the defendant. When you don't go to trial, you have this opportunity to kind of leverage the fact that the victims may not want to testify or any other deficiencies in the evidence. I know that there was Snapchat involved. Oftentimes on Snapchat, you can't secure whatever pictures or texts were sent via Snapchat because they disappear. So there might have been some evidentiary issues as well. And I guess the defense attorney leveraged all of that and was able to take advantage in his negotiations with the prosecutor. And maybe the judge saw that too. And that's why we're seeing such a low sentence. But it is pretty disturbing.
So we know how the case ends, and we can talk about her stipulations, being a sex offender and the court-appointed therapy that she needs to go in. We can get to that in a minute. But I wanted to talk about the specifics of the case because they are pretty crazy. I'll just say crazy. In the fact that she's on this staycation with her family, 2 young children, and she runs into these children and has sexual relations with them. One thing that jumped out to me immediately when I was reading through the complaint is that one of the boys who had oral sex with her and digital penetration, all of that, first of all, he's under 18, absolutely unacceptable. But the fact that she said something like, you have a woman in your bed, don't you want to have sex? Don't you want to do something? And he said in his head, he was thinking, no, I don't want to. But he didn't verbalize that. And I wanted to ask you about this specifically because consent is such a tricky thing. And I know that there's some people just outright say no, but other people freeze and don't reply. Can you explain that a bit to me? Because I don't think he did anything wrong.
Right. This is exactly why the law tries very hard to protect our most vulnerable people. Vulnerable meaning people who are underage, people who are, for example, incarcerated, people who are intoxicated very, highly, and so they're not able to consent. Our law tries very hard to protect people who fall into or would be susceptible to falling into this exact scenario, a scenario where they either can't consent or they don't feel like they have the ability to consent. Clearly, and it's not strange or uncommon at all for a teenager to not have the ability, the temerity, the confidence to be able to say no. They are in a predatory situation with a woman who somehow was able to get them into that room and herself into that room super quickly. I mean, a lot of times we see with young children, there's this grooming process, this lengthy grooming process that takes place. But this woman is clearly a very successful predator. She was able to get herself into their room and into their bed quite quickly. And so I feel, this is exactly why the law says it's a strict liability law. It doesn't matter what he said or what he even did in the end. It doesn't matter if it looked consensual. He was too young to have been put in that situation to even consent. And that's why we have this law. And thank God we do, because I do think that teenagers who are faced with this kind of situation would have a lot of this like freezing moment in their head where they don't want to say yes, they don't want to do the thing they're being kind of pushed or bullied to do, but they do it out of fear or, insecurity.
It's a really tough situation for these young boys to be in because, as you said, they couldn't give consent even if they wanted to because they're under age 18. But this boy didn't even want to. And I'm glad you brought up the word predator because it does seem like she was in this case. You pointed out no grooming. It was within the first 24 hours that all of this happened. We can get into the details a bit about that if we want to, but moving on, you talked about the hockey game and how she went to their hockey game and then she kept contact with them after. So the next day and then weeks after. That to me is again a red flag. Not only did she sexually assault them in the hotel room, but she's kind of holding on to it. I don't know. What do you make of all of that?
Yeah, it could be a couple of things. First of all, she might have actually developed some sort of feelings for this boy or these boys, which is really scary. But otherwise, it could also be her way of maintaining the privacy of what had happened, trying to convince them not to report anything to the police. I know that some of her communications with them were about that very topic, about not disclosing what had happened. And so that might have just been her way to kind of maintain pressure on them and maintain that kind of status quo of not telling anybody what happened. Her physical presence is kind of a menacing situation, if you will, because she's really giving them that reminder that like, hey, I am here, don't say anything. It's really a very predatory thing to do to maintain that communication and physical presence after the fact.
To me, right away, when you're saying this, in my head, the words consciousness of guilt are coming up because in her Snapchat messages, she's saying, don't talk to police. So she knows something is off. Then, according to the court documents, when she meets up with these kids, she says, I'm old enough to be your mother. So she knows that they're kids. A couple of times she points out, seems like consciousness of guilt to me. Do you think that's another reason why she might have taken the plea deal because prosecutors would have had a strong case?
They would have. And you're right. It is consciousness of guilt. We see in this case and sometimes in other cases where the things that people do after the fact show that they knew what they did was wrong. And that is a very effective tactic for a prosecutor to raise to a jury when that person is, being prosecuted at trial. And in fact, if that consciousness of guilt, if her actions were so clearly kind of displaying that she knew what she did was wrong, the prosecutor could even ask the judge to tell the jury that certain of her actions are considered consciousness of guilt, and that the jury could consider that in determining whether the prosecution made out their case beyond a reasonable doubt, that she knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew the age of these children, essentially, and that she knew that what she had done with them was criminal.
We talked about the light sentence. I guess I'm just going to call it a light sentence based on the 8 years she could have faced and these 2 weekends. But there are some other stipulations into all of this too. One is that she has to register as a sex offender, which to me completely makes sense. However, there's a time limit on it. It's only 10 years that she's required to register as this sex offender and then can go along in her life. That's not something I've heard. I know I usually see longer time lengths or for the rest of time. Have you heard of this 10-year deadline?
Yes. So, and you make such a good point. There are levels of sex offenders, and it's typically based off of a lot of things. Actually, there's like a checklist where, certain actions by the person during the event, certain things about that person's history. Essentially, what they do is they have a checklist to see her likelihood of reoffending. And based off of that, they determine what level sex offender she is. Now, because it's only a 10-year period of time that she has to register, it seems to me that she was able to kind of get at that lowest level, that she's the lowest level sex offender, because had she had been adjudicated a higher level sex offender, yes, she would have had to register for way longer than that, and sometimes the rest of your life. So somehow she was able to do it, which is strange to me because some of the factors that they take into consideration when determining your risk of reoffense and therefore your level sex offender are things like your previous criminal history. She has a previous criminal history. The number of victims. So in this case, I would argue that there were 3 victims, not just the 2 boys that were forced to engage, but also the 3rd boy who was forced to watch. So the number of victims kind of, again, adds points to that checklist. So that is a factor as well. There are different other factors that are taken into consideration that work to her benefit, such as the fact that, she wasn't under the influence of drugs or alcohol at the time. She doesn't have a previous felony on her record or a previous sex offense on her record, but still, I guess those numbers just added up to a low-level sex offender. But I would have probably argued, if I were the prosecutor, for what's called an upward departure and tell the judge, listen, I know that technically by the numbers, she's a low-level sex offender, but because of her actions after the fact, her very predatory actions where she's still texting them and showing up to their games, and her ability to get them in the bed so quickly. And also, apparently, she had said something to them about the fact that she had had other experiences, sexual experiences outside of her marriage. All of those add up, in my opinion, to an upward departure, meaning even though she scored at a certain low level, the judge should have found her at a higher level sex offender. I would have made that argument, and I wonder if they tried to do that.
To me, it's interesting because it almost sounds like she has 10 years and then she's done with this. It's pretty much done. She doesn't have to register as a sex offender. But for these boys, it's not over in 10 years. This happened to them and it's part of their memory and their life moving forward. In 10 years, it doesn't just disappear for them. So I think you're right. I wonder if prosecutors did argue for that. Another thing that she has to do after her light jail sentence is she has to go court-appointed mental health treatment. This makes sense to me because it's a crime involving children. What would all of that look like?
Yeah, she would be evaluated for any, I guess, mental deficiencies or, sexual proclivities that are outside the norm. And she'd probably receive some sort of diagnosis after her evaluation. And based upon that diagnosis, she would probably have to, engage in several therapy sessions. It'll depend on what the actual diagnosis is, of course, but I am glad that that was part of the sentence because clearly there is something wrong with her. I think, again, that therapist or whoever psychiatrist is going to evaluate her will also take into account the previous conviction for that DWI, because again, it just shows that impulsivity issue and her willingness to commit crimes and just not follow the law. She just lacks discipline, clearly. So I think all of that should be addressed and hopefully will be addressed in those sessions.
Lots to think about in this specific case. Serena Townsend, thank you for coming on and talking with us about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we pointed out in the interview, Schardin will have to undergo court-appointed mental health treatment after her sentence and register as a sex offender for the next 10 years. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.